Hello, this is Bill Bullard with R-CALF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, this week I'd like to visit with you about the impact that imports have on America's cattle producers. So we'll specifically address imports of beef and cattle. Recall in March, the meatpacking lobby lauded the fact that 2018 export values soared to a record high, reaching $8.4 billion. Export volumes also hit a new high, exceeding 3 billion pounds. What they didn't say is that the value of imports also reached a near record high in 2018. In fact, at $7.5 billion, they reached the third highest value on record. Only in 2014 and 15 has the 2018 value of imports ever been exceeded. For comparison purposes, imports in 2015, the year U.S. cattle prices collapsed, reached an all-time record of $9.1 billion. So while it is true that in 2018 the U.S. enjoyed a value-based surplus, it was in the amount of about $9 million. But when both imported beef and beef from imported cattle are considered, in 2018 the U.S. suffered under a volume-based world trade deficit of nearly 900 million pounds. Now, for cattlemen who sell cattle and not beef, the volume-based trade balance is what matters because the value of their cattle is determined by the demand for live cattle. And a volume-based deficit means more beef supplies are available in the U.S. market, and, all other factors being equal, an increase in beef volumes means less demand for live cattle, which means lower U.S. cattle prices. But now the meatpacking lobby tells us that imports don't compete with U.S. cattle producers. Instead, they complement them. They say that most imports are a low-quality grinding product that we mix with our high-quality trim to make hamburger for fast food restaurants, and they say this actually increases the demand for U.S. cattle. So is this true? Well, that's not at all what the U.S. Department of Agriculture says about how imports impact your cattle industry. The USDA says that beef and cattle imports generally serve to increase net social welfare. To the extent that consumers' choice is broadened and the increased supply of the imported commodity leads to a price decline, gains in consumer surplus will outweigh losses in domestic producer surplus. So contrary to the meatpacking lobby's insistence that imports complement U.S. production but does not compete with it, the USDA correctly states that imports broaden consumer choices with increased supplies, and this leads to lower beef prices that benefit consumers but harms domestic cattle producers. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to compete with this increased supply of imports, such as with mandatory country of origin labeling, so consumers can choose whether they want Honduran, Nicaraguan, or Uruguayan beef, or if they want your U.S. beef that is produced under the most stringent production and safety standards in the world? Yes, that would be nice, but your meatpacking lobby does not want to give consumers real choices, and they want to continue lowering demand for your exclusively USA cattle. But let's move on. This summer, the cattle industry trade press gave us a real-time hint on the impact of imports and quoted the USDA as saying that stronger recent domestic demand for beef has prompted an increase in imports from major suppliers. Now, when you combine that hint with real-time cattle prices, which have been declining month to month throughout this summer, you can readily deduce that this increase in imports coincides with reduced cattle prices. Now, last summer, in 2018, the U.S. Government Accountability Office issued their findings of their investigation into the cattle price collapse of 2015. Among the factors the GAO determined had a hand in reducing the demand for U.S. cattle was fluctuations in the strength of the U.S. dollar, which would shift consumer purchases toward or away from relatively less expensive imported beef, as well as contribute to shifts in net exports, that is, total exports minus total imports. In other words, the GAO found when consumers buy more of the cheaper imported beef, this increases your volume-based trade deficit and results in lower demand and lower prices for your cattle. So please ask yourself, when the USDA allows cheaper imported beef and beef from imported cattle to be labeled as a product of the USDA, how in the world do consumers voluntarily shift their purchases to cheaper imported beef? Well, they don't. The consumer purchased the beef provided by the importer, and guess who earns windfall profits when they label this cheaper undifferentiated beef with your USA label? I urge you to pick up the phone right now and call both of your U.S. senators and your U.S. representative. Urge them to restore country of origin labeling for beef as quickly as possible so you can compete in your own market. With that, we're out of time. Thank